Greetings, esteemed viewers and connoisseurs of the peculiar. Dr. John Watson here, from our humble abode at Baker Street. Tonight I invite you to join Mr. Sherlock Holmes and myself on a fresh foray into the labyrinthine mysteries that haunt the shadowed corners of London. Prepare yourselves, for the case we are about to recount is one of the most perplexing and poignant to have ever crossed the threshold of our investigations. A tale woven with threads of aristocracy, desperation, and an enigma shrouded in the very fog of our great city. It is a narrative that will test the very limits of deduction and reveal the hidden currents beneath the placid surface of society. Before we delve into the heart of this captivating puzzle, do consider a moment to subscribe to the channel, ensuring you miss none of our future adventures. Now, let's begin with the first chapter of The Lost Heir of Ashworth Hall. Chapter 1. The Ashworth Enigma. The gaslight cast long, dancing shadows across the familiar clutter of our Baker Street sitting room on that blustery November evening. A persistent drizzle lashed against the window panes, mirroring the gloom that had begun to settle over London. Holmes, sprawled in his armchair, was engaged in one of his characteristic periods of profound abstraction, a volume of forgotten Persian poetry resting unheeded on his knee. The air was thick with the faint, acrid tang of his favourite shag tobacco, a scent that, to me, was as much a part of our home as the ticking of the grandfather clock. Our tranquil evening, however, was destined for disruption. A sharp, insistent rap echoed from the street door below, followed by Mrs. Hudson's hurried ascent. She ushered into our presence a figure whose very bearing spoke of inherited wealth and a recent profound distress. He was a man of advanced years, though still robust, with a meticulously tailored frock coat that now seemed to hang somewhat loosely upon his frame. His silver hair, usually impeccably coiffed, was slightly dishevelled, and his face, etched with the lines of privilege, was now deeply furrowed with a palpable anxiety. This was Lord Ashworth, a name synonymous with one of the oldest and most respected families in England. "Holmes," he began, his voice surprisingly steady despite the tremor in his hands, "I require your unique services. My son, Edward, has vanished." Holmes shifted, his eyes, previously distant, now alight with an intense analytical gleam. "Vanished, Lord Ashworth? When, and from where?" "2 nights ago," the peer replied, sinking heavily into the chair I offered him. "From Ashworth Hall itself. We reside near Hampstead Heath, a considerable estate, as you know. Edward, my only son and heir, retired to his chambers as usual after a quiet supper. When his valet went to rouse him the following morning, the room was empty, his bed untouched. The window was ajar, despite the chill. "And what steps have you taken thus far, my lord?" Holmes inquired, leaning forward, his fingertips pressed together in his customary pose. "The local constabulary have been informed, naturally. They've searched the grounds, interrogated the staff, but they find nothing. No forced entry, no struggle. It is as if he simply walked away into the night. But Edward would never do such a thing. He is responsible, though perhaps a trifle contemplative." "Contemplative?" I echoed, intrigued. Lord Ashworth sighed, running a weary hand over his face. He spent much time in the library and recently with some rather bohemian artist in the city. A phase, I believed, but nothing to suggest such an abrupt departure. "Let us begin at the scene, Watson," Holmes declared, rising with characteristic suddenness. "Lord Ashworth, your carriage awaits, I presume?" Within the hour we were rattling through the gaslit streets, leaving the urban sprawl behind for the quieter, more verdant outskirts. Ashworth Hall stood silhouetted against the scudding clouds, a grand, imposing edifice of Gothic revival architecture, its numerous windows staring out like sightless eyes. A chill wind, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke, swept across the manicured lawns. The house was steeped in a mournful silence. The butler, a gaunt silver-haired man named Mr. Pendleton, led us directly to Edward's chambers. It was a spacious room, overlooking the sprawling gardens. The interior was, as Lord Ashworth had described, surprisingly undisturbed, save for the ajar window. A heavy crimson curtain swayed gently, admitting a sliver of the cold night air. The antique four-poster bed was neatly made, its silken coverlet unwrinkled. A few volumes of classical poetry lay scattered on a bedside table, alongside a half-smoked pipe and an open journal. Holmes, without a word, began his meticulous examination. He ignored the prominent items, focusing instead on the almost invisible. He moved like a hunter, his keen eyes sweeping across the floorboards, the sill, the frame of the window. He knelt by the fireplace, scrutinizing the ashes, then rose to examine a framed portrait of a severe-looking ancestor on the wall. He picked up the pipe, sniffed its bowl, and then set it down with a click. "Watson," he observed, his voice low, "note the lack of disturbance. No sign of a struggle, no overturned furniture, nothing to suggest a hurried departure. Yet the open window is curious. Did young Edward typically leave it open, Lord Ashworth?" "Never in this weather," the peer responded, a fresh wave of despair washing over him. "He was particular about draughts." Holmes knelt again by the window. His fingers brushed lightly along the outer sill, then he produced a small magnifying glass, peering intently at a faint smudge. "Remarkable," he murmured, more to himself than to us. "A trace of clay, distinct from the garden soil. And notice, Watson, these faint, almost imperceptible indentations on the sill. Not from a shoe, I think, but something else entirely. Perhaps a gloved hand attempting to gain purchase from the outside, or indeed, from the inside." He then moved to the journal. Flipping through its pages, he paused at a recent entry. "Poetry, as you say, my lord, but interwoven with mathematical formulae and cryptic symbols. Not the usual fare for a young man contemplating a midnight stroll," his gaze sharpened, landing on a small dark stain on the journal's cover, almost invisible against the deep green leather. "And this," he added, a hint of excitement in his tone, "a smear of printer's ink. Odd for a country estate." As we left Ashworth Hall later that night, the rain had intensified, washing the cobbled drive to a gleaming black. Holmes remained silent during our journey back to Baker Street, his brow furrowed in concentration. The raw facts were scarce, yet I knew his mind was already constructing a complex edifice of possibilities from these seemingly insignificant fragments. The disappearance of Edward Ashworth was no simple elopement or accident. The clues, subtle as they were, pointed to something far more intricate, a puzzle only Holmes could hope to unravel. The stage was set, and the Ashworth enigma had firmly captured the attention of the world's greatest consulting detective. Chapter 2. Through the London Labyrinth. The chill grey of morning had barely broken when Holmes, having spent the remainder of the night in a restless perusal of various London directories and railway timetables, announced his next course of action. "Our initial foray into the tranquil halls of Ashworth has yielded little, Watson, save for the impression that young Edward's disappearance is far from voluntary. That printer's ink, coupled with the esoteric notes in his journal, suggests a mind engaged in matters beyond the trivial pursuits of his station. We must follow this ink." Our journey led us first into the very heart of London's bustling commercial life, Smithfield Market. The air here was a cacophony of shouts, the clatter of hooves and the earthy, visceral scent of raw meat and fresh produce. Porters in blood-stained aprons navigated mountains of carcasses, while vendors hawked their wares with practised zeal. Holmes, oblivious to the chaos, guided us with unwavering resolve towards a narrow, smoke-grimed street that branched off the main thoroughfare, leading us into a district dominated by printers' workshops and paper merchants. Here, the roar of the market was replaced by the rhythmic thud and hiss of printing presses. The cloying smell of ink and damp paper thick in the air. We visited several establishments, their proprietors a varied lot, some gruff and suspicious, others overly garrulous. Holmes, with a few well-placed questions and a keen eye for detail, soon deduced that the specific dark, resinous ink he had observed on Edward's journal was a speciality, rarely used for common publications. It was, he learned, primarily employed by an old-fashioned firm known for its fine engraving and bespoke commissions, located deep within the labyrinthine alleys behind Fleet Street. The office of Messrs. Blackwood and Sons proved to be a quiet, almost sepulchral place, far removed from the clamour outside. The proprietor, a stooped, bespectacled man named Mr. Silas Grimshaw, received us with an air of weary resignation. He denied having any dealings with a young man named Edward Ashworth. However, Holmes's eyes, ever vigilant, caught a flicker of unease in the man's gaze as he spoke, and a distinct smudge of the very ink Holmes sought on the cuff of Grimshaw's shirt. "Indeed, Mr. Grimshaw," Holmes stated, his voice devoid of accusation, but laced with an undeniable certainty. "You handle unusual requests, do you not?" Perhaps an order for bespoke stationery, or the engraving of a particular symbol? Grimshaw's composure fractured. He wrung his hands, his gaze darting nervously towards a heavy locked cabinet in the corner. A gentleman, a most unusual gentleman, did commission some work recently. Private, exceedingly private. He paid handsomely for discretion. And this gentleman, Holmes pressed, did he resemble Mr. Edward Ashworth? Tall, fair-haired, with a thoughtful countenance. The printer finally capitulated. He did, sir. He ordered a series of unique pamphlets, not for public distribution, but for personal study, he claimed, full of ancient scripts and arcane symbols. He was quite insistent on the quality of the ink, requiring a particularly deep indelible black, and he used a pseudonym, Mr. E. Smythe. Holmes extracted a sample of the pamphlet from the hesitant printer. It was indeed a curious artifact, filled with meticulously reproduced illustrations of alchemical symbols and excerpts from obscure historical texts, all rendered in the distinctive dark ink. This discovery, far from clarifying the situation, only deepened the mystery surrounding the young heir. Edward was evidently pursuing secret scholarly interests, but what purpose did these peculiar pamphlets serve? Leaving Grimshaw's, we found ourselves emerging onto the Strand, where the fading afternoon light painted the grand facades of the theatres and hotels in shades of muted gold. Holmes, consulting the dates on the pamphlet's printing orders, noted that the most recent batch had been collected only a day before Edward's disappearance. He was not merely studying these, Watson. He was actively engaged in disseminating them, or perhaps preparing them for a larger project. We must ascertain who else was involved in this esoteric pursuit. Our next destination took us far from the gaslit grandeur of the West End, into the gritty, teeming heart of the East End. The air grew colder, heavier with the smell of river water and coal smoke as we drew closer to the docks. Here, the narrow, winding streets teemed with life of a different sort. Dock workers, sailors of every nationality, street vendors hawking questionable wares, and the ever-present shadows of desperate individuals. Our target was a clandestine club known as the Mariner's Knot, a den reputedly frequented by those who trafficked in unusual goods and information. The club was a grimy, smoke-filled establishment, its interior dimly lit by sputtering oil lamps. The patrons were a rough-hewn lot, their faces scarred by hard living and harder choices. Holmes, ever the master of disguise and psychological manipulation, swiftly identified a potential informant, a wizened old seaman known as Barnacle Bill, whose eyes held an unnatural sharpness despite his evident drunkenness. With a well-placed coin and a few precisely worded questions concerning peculiar publications and scholarly gentlemen, Holmes elicited a crucial piece of information. Barnacle Bill recalled a young man, matching Edward's description, who had been seen only a few nights prior distributing small dark pamphlets to a small group of earnest-looking individuals in a secluded corner of a coffee-house near the London Dunnels, a district known for its literary societies and secret clubs. He spoke of ancient knowledge, sir, rasped Bill, clutching the coin, and of a path to enlightenment, and he mentioned a rendezvous point, a garden of forgotten lore, for those keen to join his fellowship. Holmes's eyes gleamed. A fellowship, Watson. Not a solitary scholar, but a movement, and a cryptic meeting place. The Ashworth enigma is beginning to take on the hues of a deeper, more organised conspiracy. We are no longer chasing a missing boy, but an ideological pursuit. The currents beneath London's surface run deeper than mere crime, my dear fellow, much deeper. The damp, pervasive chill of the East End seemed to solidify around us, promising further cold revelations. Chapter 3. The Scholar and the Bohemian. The discovery of Edward Ashworth's involvement with an esoteric society shifted the entire complexion of the case. No longer was it a simple disappearance, but a journey into the hidden, intellectual underbelly of London, a world of secret doctrines and fervent beliefs. Holmes, invigorated by this development, determined to seek out other members or associates of this peculiar fellowship. Our pursuit led us, on a crisp, clear morning, to the hallowed halls of the British Museum reading room. The vast, domed chamber, with its hushed atmosphere and rows upon rows of serious scholars poring over ancient texts, felt a world away from the gritty docklands. Holmes, with his remarkable memory for obscure details, identified a particular volume Edward had checked out repeatedly, an extremely rare treatise on pre-Christian European mysticism, known to be a foundational text for several obscure philosophical societies. After a brief, almost silent conversation with the head librarian, a mild-mannered but exceptionally knowledgeable man named Mr. Percival Thorne, Holmes learned that Edward had frequently consulted this very book. Young Mr. Ashworth was a most diligent scholar, Mr. Thorne observed, his voice a quiet murmur. He possessed an insatiable curiosity for the recondite. He often discussed his theories with a Professor Aldous Vance, a renowned academic specializing in ancient languages, who frequents these very archives. Professor Vance proved to be a frail, elderly gentleman, his mind a veritable repository of obscure knowledge, though his eyes held a certain weary detachment from the material world. Holmes engaged him in a swift, subtle interrogation, guiding the conversation towards Edward's recent interests. Professor Vance admitted to several discussions with Edward concerning the translation of various ancient texts, including certain cryptic passages from the aforementioned mystical treaties. Edward was deeply engrossed in deciphering a particular section, Vance explained, his thin fingers adjusting his spectacles. It spoke of a Lodge of the Verdant Heart, and their supposed guardian of an ancient secret, hidden within a garden of forgotten lore. He was utterly convinced it was not mere mythology, but a genuine historical society with a continuing lineage. And did he mention any other associates in this quest? Holmes inquired, his gaze fixed on the professor's face. Vance hesitated. He did speak of an artist, a Miss Ilara Thornton, who shared his philosophical inclinations. She apparently aided him in illustrating certain symbolic diagrams for his pamphlets. Our next destination took us to a markedly different sphere, the Bohemian artistic district of Chelsea. Here, the air was tinged with the smell of turpentine and linseed oil, and the narrow streets were lined with quaint, often dilapidated studios. Miss Ilara Thornton's studio was a riot of colour and creative chaos, a stark contrast to the austere quiet of the museum. Canvases in various stages of completion cluttered every available surface, and the scent of paint was almost overpowering. Miss Thornton herself was a striking figure, unconventional in dress and manner, with fiery red hair and eyes that sparkled with intelligence and an undeniable passion. She greeted us with a mixture of suspicion and spirited defiance. "Are you here about Edward?" she demanded, before Holmes could even introduce himself. "He's quite all right, I'm sure, just lost in his work, as he often is." Holmes's voice was gentle yet firm. "Miss Thornton, Edward Ashworth has been missing for 2 days. His father is gravely concerned. We believe his disappearance is connected to the Lodge of the Verdant Heart." Her defiant facade crumbled, revealing a flicker of genuine alarm. The lodge? But he wouldn't. He was so close to finding it. The garden, I mean. She then, with a heavy sigh, revealed more. Edward, she explained, had become obsessed with the Lodge of the Verdant Heart, a centuries-old secret society dedicated to preserving ancient wisdom. He believed a critical artifact, a talisman of Erebos, which supposedly held the key to immense knowledge or power, was hidden in a secret garden, a garden of forgotten lore, long forgotten within a historical estate, somewhere on the outskirts of London. Miss Thornton had been helping him research and illustrate historical records related to the lodge. He thought he'd finally pinpointed its location, she recounted, gesturing towards a large half-finished painting depicting an overgrown walled garden with peculiar symbolic carvings on its gate. He was leaving for it the night he vanished. He was so excited, so convinced he was on the cusp of a great discovery. He even had a key, a peculiar old iron key, that he believed would open the gate to this hidden garden. "A key?" I interjected, a sudden sense of dread washing over me. "Did he describe it?" "Yes," she replied, her eyes wide with sudden realization. It was very old, intricately wrought, with a strange serpentine head on the bow. Holmes's expression hardened. "And was anyone else aware of his plans, Miss Thornton? Anyone who might have wished to intercept him, or perhaps claim this talisman for themselves?" She paused, her brow furrowed in thought. "Only his cousin, Mr. Percival Thorne. He often scoffed at Edward's follies, but he was always strangely interested in Edward's research, especially about the Ashworth family's old land deeds and historical connections. He knew about the key too. Edward had shown it to him. The mention of Mr. Percival Thorne, the same name as the librarian from the British Museum, struck me as more than a mere coincidence. Holmes's eyes, however, seemed to look beyond this, into a deeper pattern. The trail of the lost heir of Ashworth Hall was no longer merely intellectual. It had acquired a sinister predatory edge. The Garden of Forgotten Lore now sounded less like a place of discovery and more like a potential trap. The clear morning air of Chelsea seemed to turn cold, hinting at a lurking danger. Chapter 4. The Shadow on the Thames. The revelation of Edward's secret quest and the mention of his cousin, Mr. Percival Thorne, had injected a new urgency into our investigation. The clear blue sky that had graced Chelsea now gave way to a dense yellowish fog rolling in from the Thames, clinging to every building and street lamp as we made our way back towards the river. The very air grew heavy with the damp chill and the acrid smell of coal smoke, blurring the familiar cityscape into a phantasmagoria of distorted shapes. Percival Thorne, Holmes mused aloud as we hailed a cab, the gas lamps of the cab slicing feeble arcs in the swirling mist. A rather common name, Watson, but the librarian who bore the same name knew Professor Vance, who in turn knew Edward's esoteric interests. A curious coincidence, perhaps, or a deliberate misdirection. The threads, my dear fellow, are beginning to intertwine. Holmes's plan was to confront Mr. Percival Thorne, not the librarian, but the cousin. However, a preliminary inquiry at Thorne's known address, a respectable townhouse in Westminster, yielded nothing but an empty residence and an evasive housekeeper. Thorne had departed abruptly that morning, leaving no forwarding address. "He is running, Watson," Holmes declared, his face grim in the swirling fog. "And if he is running, he has something to hide. His interest in Edward's research, his knowledge of the key, it all points to a motive far more tangible than a mere disagreement over philosophy." Holmes then produced a small leather-bound map he had procured from Miss Thornton's studio, a meticulously annotated sketch of an ancient estate, clearly identifiable as one of the older Ashworth properties, long since fallen into disrepair and passed out of the main family line. On it, a specific section was ringed in red. An overgrown, walled-off area marked the old physic garden. This, Holmes deduced, was Edward's Garden of Forgotten Lore. The key, the garden, and a man suddenly absconding, Holmes muttered, consulting his pocket watch. The pieces fit. The question is, where would such a man go when he seeks to evade detection in London's impenetrable fog? His answer came suddenly, his eyes lighting up with that familiar spark of intuition. The river, Watson. The Thames offers anonymity and escape, particularly to those with nefarious intentions, and in this fog it is a veritable cloak. Our cab veered towards the river, the fog growing steadily thicker, muffling all sounds until only the distant, mournful bleat of a foghorn cut through the oppressive silence. We disembarked near a row of disused warehouses, their skeletal structures barely visible through the shroud of mist. The air here was heavy with the smell of brine, decay, and stagnant water. The cobbled pathway was slick with condensation, and the faint, unsettling lapping of the river against unseen barges was the only constant sound. Holmes moved with an almost preternatural sense of direction, navigating the treacherous footing and avoiding unseen obstacles. We passed silent moored vessels, their masts reaching like skeletal fingers into the impenetrable grey. The sense of isolation was profound. The feeling of being utterly alone in a world swallowed by the fog was deeply unsettling. Suddenly, Holmes stopped, his hand shooting out to grasp my arm. "Listen, Watson." Through the dense fog, a faint metallic clang reached our ears, followed by the muffled thud of a heavy object. It seemed to emanate from one of the larger, more dilapidated warehouses further along the quay. Holmes's face was taut with anticipation. "Our quarry, I believe." We proceeded with extreme caution, our footsteps barely audible on the damp stones. The entrance to the warehouse was a gaping maw in the mist-shrouded building, its massive wooden doors ajar. Inside, the gloom was even more profound, broken only by the feeble glow of a single lantern hanging from a central beam, casting grotesque shadows among stacks of crates and forgotten machinery. The air was cold, dusty and heavy with the smell of aged timber and river damp. A hushed conversation reached our ears from behind a towering stack of burlap sacks. Holmes drew his service revolver, checking the chambers, and motioned for me to do the same. We advanced slowly, keeping to the shadows. As we rounded the towering sacks, the scene before us sent a jolt of alarm through me. Mr. Percival Thorne stood with his back to us, his voice raised in an urgent, hushed exchange with two rough-looking individuals whose faces were partially obscured by the shadows. On a nearby crate, glinting dully in the dim light, lay the distinctive serpentine-headed iron key Miss Thornton had described. Beside it lay a crudely drawn map identical to the one Edward had used, albeit with new aggressive markings. Thorne, his face etched with a mixture of greed and desperation, was pointing towards a detailed sketch of the old physic garden. "We must be quick," he hissed to his accomplices. "That fool Edward believed he was merely seeking knowledge, but the talisman, it is said to be worth a king's ransom. We must intercept him there. He knows the precise location, you see. He will lead us right to it." Suddenly one of the ruffians, a burly man with a scarred cheek, gestured wildly towards a far corner of the warehouse. "Look, over there! It's him!" My heart hammered against my ribs. "Edward!" But before I could react, the figure, barely visible in the deepest shadows, darted away, disappearing into the labyrinth of crates. A desperate cry, muffled and indistinct, echoed through the vast space. "He's seen us!" Thorne shouted, turning abruptly, his eyes widening in shock as they landed on Holmes and me. "Fool! Get them!" The two ruffians sprang forward, their faces contorted in menacing scowls. Holmes, however, was already in motion. "Watson, the key! Secure it!" he commanded before engaging one of the ruffians with a swift, economical blow that sent the man sprawling. I meanwhile lunged for the key, my heart pounding as the other ruffian moved to intercept me. The warehouse, swallowed by the fog, had become a perilous stage for a desperate struggle, and Edward Ashworth, the lost heir, was still very much lost within its menacing shadows. The river, unseen but ever present, seemed to whisper of secrets yet to be revealed. Chapter 5. The Verdant Heart Revealed. The confrontation in the warehouse was brief but intense. Holmes, with his characteristic blend of intellectual prowess and surprising physical agility, quickly subdued one assailant, while I, employing skills honed in military service, managed to disarm the second, securing the serpentine key. Mr. Percival Thorne, caught between fight and flight, made a desperate dash for the open warehouse door, hoping to melt into the impenetrable fog. However, a quick-thinking police constable, attracted by the disturbance and Holmes's prearranged summons, emerged from the mist like an apparition, apprehending Thorne before he could vanish. With Thorne secured and his henchmen in custody, the immediate danger subsided. Yet, the fate of Edward Ashworth remained an unsettling enigma. The cry from the shadows still echoed in my mind. "He's seen us," Thorne had said, implying Edward was close, perhaps even trapped within the warehouse. A meticulous search of the vast, dusty interior revealed nothing. Holmes, however, discovered a faint scuff mark on a forgotten trapdoor hidden beneath a pile of sacks, leading to a shallow cellar below. The cellar too was empty, save for a discarded piece of rope and a faint sweet smell, almost floral. "He was here, Watson," Holmes declared, rising from his examination of the cellar floor, "and he left through here. This trapdoor leads to a disused service tunnel that, according to these old dock plans I observed, runs beneath the riverbank, emerging near the old Ashworth properties. He must have intended to use it to reach the Garden of Forgotten Lore undetected. The dawn was breaking as we emerged from the warehouse, the fog slowly lifting to reveal a world washed clean by the night's dampness. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and awakening London. We sped towards the Ashworth family's forgotten estate, the map from Miss Thornton's studio guiding our way. The estate, a neglected stretch of land several miles from Ashworth Hall, was a picture of elegant decay. Overgrown trees formed an impenetrable canopy, and crumbling stone walls hinted at past grandeur. Deep within this wilderness, Holmes located the entrance to the old physic garden. It was indeed a place of forgotten lore, its wrought iron gate choked with ivy, its ancient stones worn smooth by time. The serpentine key, once inserted into the lock, turned with a rusty click. Inside, the garden was a verdant tangle of ancient roses, forgotten herbs, and towering gnarled trees. A path, barely visible beneath a carpet of fallen leaves, wound its way towards a small, dilapidated stone folly. It was here, amongst the ivy-clad ruins, that we found him. Edward Ashworth sat huddled on a stone bench, pale and dishevelled, but alive. He clutched a small, intricately carved wooden box to his chest, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and exhilaration. Near him lay a half-eaten loaf of bread and a flask of water. "Edward!" I exclaimed, rushing forward. He looked up, startled, his face breaking into a relieved, if somewhat bewildered, smile. "Dr. Watson, Mr. Holmes, you found me." He then explained everything, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and conviction. He had indeed been researching the Lodge of the Verdant Heart and their legendary talisman. He believed it was not a magical artifact, but a repository of ancient botanical knowledge, a cure for a rare family illness that had plagued the Ashworth line for generations. His late mother had suffered from it, and he feared for his father. The talisman of Erebos was, in fact, a collection of highly rare medicinal seeds and ancient formulae for herbal remedies, concealed within the garden's folly. He had planned to retrieve it in secret, fearing his father's scepticism and the ridicule of others. He knew Percival Thorne was interested, but didn't realise the extent of his greed. Edward had used the tunnel to escape Thorne's men in the warehouse, having just secured the box, believing they were after him for the talisman. He had hidden in the cellar, then made his way through the tunnel, emerging into the woods surrounding the old garden, where he'd taken refuge in the folly. The sweet floral smell in the cellar was from the freshly opened wooden box, carrying the faint aroma of dried herbs and ancient seeds. Holmes, observing Edward's emaciated condition, and listening to his earnest tale, nodded slowly. A tale of scientific passion mistaken for esoteric folly, leading to a desperate struggle against avarice. Thorne, it seems, was not only aware of the financial value of some ancient family treasure, but also knew of Edward's particular vulnerability regarding his family's health. He intended to intercept Edward, claim the talisman, which he wrongly assumed to be jewels or gold, and either silence him or hold him for ransom. Later, as the sun climbed higher, bathing the forgotten garden in a golden light, Lord Ashworth arrived, his face a mixture of profound relief and utter bewilderment. He embraced his son, promising to support his research and lamenting his own blindness to Edward's true intentions. Percival Thorne, it was later discovered, had indeed been motivated by a desperate gambling debt and a distorted sense of entitlement to the Ashworth legacy. He had seen Edward's esoteric pursuits as a foolish distraction, until he learned of a rumour that the talisman was a vast fortune hidden by ancestors, a rumour he had twisted to his own nefarious ends. The Ashworth enigma was solved, a tale not of death, but of a desperate search for knowledge thwarted by greed. As we drove away from the now vibrant garden of forgotten lore, its mysteries unveiled, I reflected on the intricate dance of human motivations that Holmes so effortlessly unravelled. Another case closed, another testament to the exceptional intellect of my dear friend. Thank you for joining us on this thrilling adventure. Subscribe for more